The lamp in the imperial tent on the Danube frontier burned through a wet October night in the year 171, and the man writing by its light was the Emperor of Rome. He was not writing dispatches, nor laws, nor letters to the Senate, but private notes to himself in Greek, on a wax tablet or a small codex, which he addressed to no one and which he never intended to be read. He wrote in the hand of a tired man who would rise before dawn to inspect the legions. Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. He wrote this not as a complaint, but as a preparation. He wrote it because in a few hours he would walk out of the tent into a camp of soldiers, scribes, embassies, suppliants, complaints, and decisions, and he would carry the weight of an empire whose northern frontier was, that autumn, on the edge of collapse. And he wrote it, knowing that no one, in all likelihood, would ever read what he had written, and that this was, in itself, the point. We are told by the ancient sources that Marcus Aurelius spent the better part of the last decade of his life in military camps along the Danube, prosecuting a long, grinding, unglamorous war against the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatians. We are told that during those years he composed, in stolen moments, the 12 books we now call the Meditations. And we are told, by his own hand, that he wrote them for himself, not for posterity, not for instruction, not for fame, for the discipline of his own soul. This is the principle we will sit with tonight. The Stoics called it, in various formulations, kathekon, the appropriate act, the proper function, the duty that belongs to one's station. But Marcus refined the idea in a particular direction, and it is this refinement we must consider. That duty performed in obscurity, duty performed when no one is watching, duty performed when no one will ever know it was performed, is the highest form of duty. That the act done for its own sake, without witness, without record, without expectation of reward or recognition, is the act that most fully expresses what a rational being is. He puts it plainly in the 7th book. A man should be upright, not be kept upright. The image is of a column or a wall that stands by its own structure, not because something props it from outside. The good man does not require the gaze of others to remain good. He does not require applause to act well. He does not require a chronicler to record his virtue. He acts, and the acting is itself complete. And elsewhere, in the 5th book, in a passage that has been quoted often and understood seldom, Marcus writes, When thou hast done a good act, and another has received it, why dost thou still look for a third thing besides these, as fools do, either to have the reputation of having done a good act, or to obtain a return? Consider what is being said here. The fool, Marcus says, performs an act, and then looks for 2 further things beyond the act itself. He looks to be known for having done it, and he looks to be repaid for having done it. But the act and the receiving of the act are already the whole of the matter. To want a third thing is to misunderstand what action is for. It is to misunderstand what a human being is. This is the principle. Duty performed in obscurity, not duty performed and then hidden as a kind of modesty, not duty performed in secret as a kind of moral theatre for an absent audience, but duty performed with such completeness in itself that the question of witness does not arise. The work is its own end. The act is its own ground. Let us now consider the man and the circumstance because the principle is not abstract for Marcus. It was carved into the conditions of his life. He was born in the year 121 into a wealthy Roman family with consular connections and was noticed early by the Emperor Hadrian, who arranged that he be adopted into the line of succession through Antoninus Pius. From the age of 17, he knew he would, barring catastrophe, become emperor. He had decades to prepare. He studied philosophy under Junius Rusticus, who gave him a copy of the Discourses of Epictetus. He studied rhetoric under Fronto, with whom he corresponded for years in letters that survive. He learned the administration of the empire by watching Antoninus, whom he loved, and whose death in the year 161 made him at last what he had long been trained to be. He did not want it. We are told by the historians, and we may read between the lines of his own writing, that the office was for him a burden carried out of duty. He insisted, against precedent, that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, be made co-emperor. He worked, he took up cases, he sat in the courts, he read petitions, he delegated where he could, and shouldered what he could not delegate. And then the wars came. In 162, the Parthians attacked in the east, and Lucius was sent to deal with them. The legions that returned from that war brought with them a plague, what the ancients called the Antonine Plague, which we now think was probably smallpox, and which swept through the empire for years, killing perhaps a tenth of the population, perhaps more. Then, around the year 166, the German tribes north of the Danube began to press across the frontier in numbers that had not been seen for generations. The Marcomanni broke through. The Quadi joined them. By 170, they had reached Italy itself, besieging Aquileia, and Roman troops, weakened by the plague, depleted by the eastern campaigns, struggled to hold. It was into this that Marcus, in his late 40s, was forced to go. He was not a soldier. He had never campaigned. He was a scholar, a philosopher, a man whose body, by his own admission, was weak, whose stomach troubled him, who slept badly. He left Rome and went north to the Danube, and he stayed there, with brief interruptions, for the rest of his life. He died in a military camp, probably at Vindobona, which is now Vienna, in the year 180. He was 58. Picture the conditions. The Danube frontier, in autumn and winter, is cold and wet and grey. The camps were earth and timber, ringed with ditches, smelling of smoke and horses and unwashed men. Tents of leather and canvas, braziers, the constant noise of a camp at work, the rhythm of watches, the cries of pack animals. Marcus, the emperor of the known world, slept on a camp bed. He ate the food the soldiers ate by all accounts, and not lavishly. He held audiences in a tent. He received Germanic embassies in a tent. He buried, during those years, several of his children, including his son Verus Caesar, and his wife Faustina died on the eastern progress of 175. Lucius, his co-emperor, had died of a stroke in 169. He was very much alone, and he wrote at night by lamplight, in Greek, which was the language of philosophy. The first book of the Meditations is a long act of acknowledgement, naming each person from whom he had learned something, from his grandfather to his tutors to Antoninus, naming the virtue or the lesson he had received from each. It is the work of a man taking stock. It is the work of a man who senses he is at an ending and who wishes to set down what he was given before he forgets. And then, from the second book onward, the work becomes what it remains, a long, private discipline, a man speaking to himself, reminding himself, correcting himself, returning again and again to the same handful of principles, because principles, Marcus knew, do not stay learned. They must be relearned each morning. What he wrote was not meant for us. This is the thing one must hold in mind when one reads the Meditations. He did not title it. He did not arrange it. He did not edit it for publication. The Greek text we have was preserved by what mechanism we do not entirely know, and surfaced centuries later and reached the printing presses of the Renaissance, and so came down to us. But Marcus, writing in his tent on the Danube, was not writing to us. He was writing to himself. He was performing on the page the very principle we are considering. He was acting without witness. And the war ground on. There were victories, there were treaties, there were betrayals by the tribes who had signed the treaties and renewed campaigns to enforce what had been broken. There was a usurpation in the East in 175 when Avidius Cassius, a respected general, declared himself emperor on the false report of Marcus's death, and Marcus had to march east to deal with it, and Cassius was killed by his own officers before Marcus arrived. And Marcus, we are told, regretted that he was deprived of the chance to pardon him. There was no clean ending. The frontier was not pacified. When Marcus died in 180, the war was still going on, and his son Commodus, who succeeded him, soon withdrew from it on terms that many in the army considered shameful. The work Marcus had given his last decade to was, in the practical sense, undone within months of his death. He must have suspected this. He must have known that Commodus, whom he had elevated to co-emperor and groomed for succession, was not the man the empire needed. The historians are harsh on Marcus for this choice, and perhaps justly. He was a father, and he loved his son, and he could not perhaps see what others saw, or he saw it and could not bring himself to act against it. We do not know. The Meditations do not tell us. They are silent on Commodus. But what they are not silent on is the discipline of acting well without expectation of result. This is where the principle of duty performed in obscurity meets the actual conditions of Marcus's life. He campaigned on a frontier that would not stay pacified. He governed an empire that was by every measure in slow decline. He labored for an outcome he could not secure, in a war he could not finish, for a successor who would undo his work, and he did so without dramatizing the futility, without self-pity, without ever, in the writings he left, allowing himself the consolation of complaint. How did he do this? Let us look at the text. In the 6th book, he writes, "Do not act as if thou wert going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over thee. While thou livest, while it is in thy power, be good." The phrase is short, almost curt. Be good, not become good, not improve thyself, not arrange a legacy. Be good now, in this hour, while thou livest. The action is its own ground. In the 4th book, men seek retreats for themselves, houses in the country, seashores, and mountains. But this is altogether a mark of the most common sort of men, for it is in thy power, whenever thou shalt choose to retire into thyself. For nowhere either with more quiet or more freedom from trouble does a man retire than into his own soul. The man writing this was sleeping in a military tent. He had no country house available to him. He had no seashore. He had a camp and a campaign and a war, and within all of this he reminds himself that the retreat that matters is interior, and the interior retreat is not an escape from duty. It is the place from which duty is performed cleanly, without the corruption of self-regard. In the 8th book, the principle appears in its most pointed form. The best way of avenging thyself is not to become like the wrongdoer. The act is not for the wrongdoer. The act is not even, in the deepest sense, for the world. The act is for the self that performs it, in the narrow sense that the self that performs the act becomes, by the performance, more or less itself. To act well is to be well. To act badly is to be badly. This is the architecture beneath the obscurity. Marcus is not arguing that hidden virtue is more noble than visible virtue out of some preference for modesty. He is arguing something stranger and more rigorous, that the visibility or invisibility of the act is irrelevant to the act, because the act's whole purpose is internal to the actor. The act is what the actor is in the moment of acting. To do a good deed for the sake of being seen, to do it is, by the Stoic accounting, not to do a good deed at all, because the motive has corrupted the structure. The act has been hollowed out from within. It looks the same from outside. It is not the same. And so Marcus, in the tent, by the lamp, writes notes to himself that no one will read, and in the morning he goes out and hears the petitions and reviews the troops and dictates the letters and meets the embassies, and what he does in public and what he writes in private are governed by the same discipline, because for him there is no difference between the public man and the private man. The Stoic ideal is integrity in its root sense, integration, wholeness, the absence of seam between the inner life and the outer. He writes in the 3rd book, "Such as are thy habitual thoughts, such also will be the character of thy mind, for the soul is dyed by the thoughts." The dying is constant. The soul takes the color of what is thought, not occasionally, but continuously. To think clean thoughts in private is to be a clean man in public. To think corrupt thoughts in private while behaving well in public is to be a corrupt man performing cleanness, and the performance will eventually fail because the die has gone the other way. Now let us draw out what the principle is teaching. It is teaching, first, that the worth of an action is not located in its visibility. This is a statement that runs against much of how human beings ordinarily think about action. We ordinarily think that the worth of an act has some relationship to its being seen, recorded, remembered, rewarded. We assume, often without examining the assumption, that an act witnessed is somehow more real than an act unwitnessed. The Stoic position, and Marcus's position in particular, is that this is precisely backwards. The witnessed act is, if anything, suspect, because the witnessing introduces a motive that may corrupt the act. The unwitnessed act, the act performed when no one will ever know, is the cleaner case, because in it, the motive is not contaminated by the prospect of reward or reputation. It is teaching, second, that duty is bound to station. Marcus did not invent his role. He did not seek it. He inherited it, and he understood it as a kathekon, a thing appropriate to his particular position in the order of things. The emperor's duty is not the soldier's duty. The soldier's duty is not the philosopher's duty. The philosopher's duty is not the farmer's duty. Each has what belongs to him. To perform what belongs to you, fully, without envy of another's portion, and without flight from your own, is what the Stoic calls living according to nature. And to perform it whether or not anyone notices is to perform it as it ought to be performed. It is teaching, third, that the question of outcome is separate from the question of action. Marcus campaigned on a frontier that would not stay pacified. He prepared a successor who would undo his work. He buried children. He buried his wife. He buried his co-emperor. And he kept writing, kept campaigning, kept governing, because the action, for him, was not contingent on its succeeding. The action was contingent on its being right. The outcome belonged to fortune. The action belonged to him. This is perhaps the hardest part of the principle to hold in mind, because it cuts against the deepest habit of the practical man, which is to measure his actions by their results. The Stoic does not deny that results matter. The Stoic denies that results are the basis on which the worth of an action is to be judged. The general fights to win, but the general's virtue is not in the winning, it is in the fighting well. And if fortune denies the win, the virtue remains. It is teaching forth. And this is the point at which the principle becomes a discipline rather than a theory, that the self that acts must be cultivated continuously in obscurity by means like the writing of private notes by lamplight. The meditations are not the lesson. The meditations are the evidence that the lesson was being practiced. The lesson is the practice itself. To return each evening to the discipline of asking how the day went, what was done well, what was done badly, what must be remembered for tomorrow. To return each morning to the discipline of preparing the mind for the kinds of people one will meet, the kinds of frustrations one will encounter, the kinds of choices one will face. This is what Marcus did, and he did it for no one but himself. The practice was the point. There is a temptation when reading Marcus to make him into a model, a hero, a figure of inspiration, and to forget that he himself would have rejected this framing. He did not want admirers. He wanted to do his work. The Meditations are not a self-help book. They are not a leadership manual. They are not a treatise. They are the working notebook of a man trying, day by day, in conditions of considerable difficulty, to be the kind of person he had been taught a rational being should be. He was not always successful. He says so himself. He upbraids himself in many passages for irritability, for distraction, for a tendency to let the bad behavior of others disturb his peace. He is, in the writings, a man in process, not a man arrived. This is what makes him worth reading. Not that he had attained the discipline, that he was each day trying again to attain it. And the conditions, one must remember, were not abstract. He was cold. He was tired. He was often sick. He was grieving. He was at war. He was managing a vast bureaucracy from a tent. He was making decisions whose consequences would shape millions of lives. And under all of this, he was holding himself, by means of nightly writing and morning preparation, to a standard that no one was enforcing. No one was checking his notebook. No one would have known if he had stopped writing. No one would have known if the private man and the public man had begun gradually to diverge. He did not let them diverge. That is what the Meditations are, the record of the work of not letting them diverge, the labor of integration performed in obscurity, night after night, for years, by a man who knew that the work was its own ground, and that the witness, if any witness was needed, was himself. So consider now, in the quiet of your own attention, what the principle asks of you. It does not ask you to abandon ambition. It does not ask you to refuse recognition when it comes. It asks you to examine when you act. whether the act would still be performed if no one would ever know. It asks you to notice when the desire to be seen begins to shape the act, to inflect it, to bend it slightly toward performance. It asks you to attend to the seam, the place where the public man and the private man meet, and to refuse to let that seam become a gap. It asks you also to consider that the work most worth doing may be work no one will see, that the discipline of being a certain kind of person is built not in the visible hours, but in the unwitnessed ones, that what you do when no one is looking is, in some sense, what you are. And it asks you to do the work without insisting on its completion. Marcus did not see his war finished. Marcus did not see his empire saved. Marcus did not even, by the evidence of history, succeed in raising a son who would carry the discipline forward. He did the work anyway. He wrote anyway. He governed anyway. He campaigned anyway. He did not bargain with the universe for an outcome in exchange for his effort. He gave the effort and let the outcome belong to whatever forces would shape it. There is a question that may stay with you tonight, and I will not press it, only set it down. What would you continue to do if you knew that no one would ever know you had done it, and that the work itself would not be finished in your lifetime? Sit with the question. The answer, if there is one, will not arrive quickly. It is not meant to. Marcus wrote, near the end of the Meditations, in the 12th book, "Pass then through this little space of time conformably to nature, and end thy journey in content, just as an olive falls off when it is ripe, blessing nature who produced it, and thanking the tree on which it grew." He died in a camp on the frontier of what was probably plague in the spring of 180. The notebook by his bed was not titled, it was not addressed, it had no preface and no conclusion. It was simply the work he had been doing, by lamplight, for himself, for as long as he could. The work was complete in the doing. The witnessing came later and would have surprised him, and is not, in the end, what mattered. Be well, do your work,